Hello and welcome to this video where we'll be taking a look at a few curious devices for the original Sony PlayStation. What we have here are two devices which can emulate other game consoles on your PS1, those systems being the Nintendo Game Boy, Sega Master System, Sega Game Gear, and interestingly the more powerful NEC PC-Engine or TurboGrafx 16 console. Now, I wasn't expecting anything great from these emulators. In fact, from what I've read about them, they're supposed to be pretty dismal, but I still find these types of products quite fascinating. I've been wanting to take a look at these things for quite a while now, and it was only recently I received the Emulator Z device from a friend of mine back in the UK. He hadn't been able to get it to work at all besides a launch screen, and I was pretty keen to get it up and running. The Emulator Z is the most feature-packed of the two devices, offering emulators for 4 consoles, and it reads the ROM files off of a CD the user burns themselves. There are no included ROMs, so it's up to the end user to source these files. So how good or bad is this device? Well, let's find out. I followed all of the instructions in the manual, which was a pretty interesting read. Apparently, this device was upgradable through some sort of online update you could burn to a disk, but I didn't have any luck finding any new firmware for it. The manual says we need an original PS1 game inserted before we can use the device. But I've just realised this PlayStation is actually mod chipped and we can get started without using any original discs. We've got a Mode 2 CD here with a handful of files on it, and the Emulator Z will apparently auto-detect the formats. So you can see here we've skipped the PlayStation startup screen and we're taken directly into the Emulator Z menu. I've only put a handful of games on this disc, but as the ROMs are so small you could easily fit hundreds of games on each CD, but is it worth it? I thought we'd start with some Oddworld adventures from the Nintendo Game Boy. The PlayStation should feel at home running an Oddworld title, so let's see how it plays. The first thing you'll notice here is the load times are pretty long. I've had to speed this up quite a bit, but it takes on average 40 seconds to load a Game Boy game. Now that we're finally in the game, it's here we discover that there is no audio at all. There is an option with this emulator to load music directly off of a CD during gameplay, but it's still pretty disappointing that the simplicity of the Game Boy sounds aren't present here, but I guess we can edit some music in to see how it would feel. Okay, so now that we're actually playing the game, I can only describe the feel of it as very janky and sort of unresponsive. Now I do have this game for the Game Boy, and I can definitely say whilst it isn't perfect with its controls, it isn't really like this. It feels as though some inputs are delayed or held for longer than I'm actually pressing them. Graphically, I'd say it's pretty much what I expected. We're playing in a window with a pretty garish background, though I believe there are up to 2 other backgrounds we can choose from. If you press L1 and R1, you'll be taken to a menu where you're able to do a few extra things. We can change the window size to a larger one and mess with a few video settings. Strangely, I found the game played a little better when using the larger window. It was as if the controls became a little more accurate somehow. In the smaller window, I found it hard even getting through these basic jumps, but with the larger window it felt much smoother and I could do it easily. I'd say in this mode it feels just about playable, but only just. There are some other features we can play around with though. It's possible to edit the 4 shades of grey using an inbuilt palette editor. It's very clunky to use and feels awful, but it does the job. So, rather than ruin the colour scheme of Oddworld, let's try another Game Boy game. We've got Micro Machines this time, one of my favourite series, so I'm hoping for some smooth, fun, action-packed gameplay. The menus feel extremely sluggish. It's as though the emulator is really struggling with this game. All I can say about the actual racing is it's sort of playable, but in a very off, slow kind of way, not something I'd recommend. I thought it'd be fun to play around with the palettes again, but when I did I started getting some issues. The game would slow down and eventually crash, and I'm not sure why. I decided at this stage we'd leave the Game Boy emulator and move on. Next, I was really keen to see how the Master System and Game Gear emulated. It makes sense as an emulator for both of those systems as they're very similar to each other. I thought we'd start off with Sonic on the Master System. This time it only took a mere 25 seconds to load, so I was pretty excited this could be a better performing emulator. You can imagine how quickly those hopes were dashed when this is what I was presented with. So, I thought it might be good to reflect on what we just heard there, and all I can really suggest is that this emulator is running very slow and the sound is really dragging along. But even if we speed the footage up, it's so horrifically far away from how the Master System sounds. All I can do is a comparison, and it can't emulate the sound properly at all, so have a listen and see what you think. Now, can you guess how this controls? Because in all honesty, it controls as good as it sounds. There's input lag, weird delays, and it quite obviously runs very slowly. Don't get me wrong, it does indeed run. It looks actually not too bad when you're not moving, and I can appreciate that it's probably not easy creating a Master System emulator on the PlayStation console, considering when this device was probably made. But would I be throwing away my Master System and using my PlayStation to get my Sega fix? Well, obviously not. I love that you can play a Sonic game on your PlayStation, and I do genuinely find this kind of thing really fascinating, but as a product that you'd buy specifically for this feature, I'd say it's completely unplayable. And that's purely down to how bad the audio is emulated. I can put up with a slow frame rate, janky controls, but that audio is awful. Here's Sonic 2 for the Master System, and it's the same story really. It took twice as long to load and somehow managed to sound even worse, so I think it's time to move on from this and onto the Game Gear emulator. And I have a sneaking suspicion we might be in for something very similar. Okay, it's Game Gear time and we'll be going right back into Sonic, and here's hoping that somehow this is a better emulation. Well, I can't say that I'm totally shocked, to be honest. It's very, very similar to what we've seen with the Master System emulation. So for your enjoyment, here's a quick snippet of Game Gear emulation on the PlayStation. So, we come now to the final emulator, which is the PC-Engine, the most capable machine we're looking to emulate here. Considering the quality of the other emulators, I can't say that I expect much from this, but I'm hoping to be surprised. We've got Bonk's Adventure to play first, so let's see how we go. As we've come to expect, load times are plentiful, and it took around 35 seconds to get into the game. Sadly, as with the Game Boy emulator, there's no sound here, but to be honest, I wouldn't say that's our biggest issue. There's some extremely messed up graphics going on, sprites are either not showing up or are corrupted, and the gameplay speed is the slowest yet. As we get into the game, all I can say is it's genuinely unplayably slow. It makes even the controller feel heavy. With so many missing graphics, no sound, and the gameplay being this slow, I'd say this isn't usable in any way. This does not belong on a product that you pay money for. I tried to load Blazing Lasers, but it just wasn't having it, so we're moving on to the final game we'll be testing, which is R-Type. This ran much better. It was still slow and missing graphics, but it was sort of, and I do mean sort of, playable. Still not something I would recommend, and my PC Engine is safe for now. I'd say this is running about 5 to 6 times slower than the actual hardware, and it's interesting that I'm now piloting a set of lines. The enemies seem to appear not too bad though. Now, outside of this video, I have been playing with the Emulator Z a bit more, so what are my thoughts on it? In my opinion, the emulation is poor at best. The GameBoy emulator is just about usable, but it's still quite unstable. The Sega emulation creates sounds I never knew existed, and the gameplay is just too slow. The PC Engine side of things is obviously the worst, and it is completely unusable. I find the Emulator Z a really curious little thing. I'm glad to have it as part of a PlayStation collection, but it's not something I'll likely be using again. So, this brings us to our other device, the Game Boy Emulator by Carrot. I believe another version of this device was also brought out under Datel. Inside the box we find the device itself along with a lot of extra material and adverts for other similar products, and there's quite a selection to choose from here. Okay, so now that we've had a peruse through the brochures, let's take a look at the device itself. What makes this device different from the Emulator Z is that it takes actual Game Boy cartridges rather than loading files off of a CD. Upon starting the PlayStation, we're taken straight into the emulator itself. There's no PlayStation startup or menu. If the device doesn't detect the Game Boy cartridge, which it frequently failed to, then you'll be taken to an inbuilt game we can play. The problem is there's something very familiar going on here. There's no sound and a sluggish feeling to the controls. I'm pretty sure we've seen that background before too. The inbuilt game, Rebound, is not a bad little game considering, and we've got a few colours going on too. After many attempts, I was finally able to get the cartridge to load, and we can have a look at Pokemon Blue running on the PlayStation. It's nice to see we can use additional colours here by default too. At this stage though, it's pretty obvious that this emulator is the same, or a slightly different version of what we've already seen on the Emulator Z, and the menu here confirms it. The good thing is that whilst it wasn't great, the Game Boy emulator was at least playable when it worked, and there's something really cool about plugging a Pokemon cartridge into your Sony PlayStation and having it work, even if it's a little off. I'd say for that novelty alone, I'd give this device a pass. I just wish it had sound. I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at these strange devices and how they work, or I guess don't work on the PlayStation. I'll leave you with some janky Pokemon Blue emulation. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.